Speaking of duration, let's look at the work interval duration. So this is the length of any interval work bout. And there's really thousands of possibilities. And again, you have to ask yourself, what are you training for? Again, if we use the example of working for 1 minute at 90%, this might be a good work bout for somebody who's running a 400 meter. If somebody's looking to run a marathon, then 1 minute, 1 minute intervals are really not going to do them much good unless they're doing some type of really limited amount of time speed training. But if you're running a marathon or a half marathon, you want to be doing intervals that are quite a little bit longer, and obviously as a result, your intensity will have to be less. So you have to ask yourself, what are you training for? And as a result, we can kind of determine how long to make each interval. However, there are some caveats to that, and we'll look at that in a second. Again, part of this first part is, what are you training for? We're looking at aerobic versus anaerobic conditioning. The longer your interval and the higher the intensity, the more we're going to tap into our anaerobic energy systems, thereby producing lactic acid and thereby really feeling fatigued versus working at interval durations that are a little bit longer but with a lower intensity, and thus tapping into more of the aerobic system. So again, we talked about a couple caveats to this what are you training for question, right? And again, there's a little bit of discrepancy. So we talked about low intensity, long duration generally taps into your aerobic system, right? Whereas higher intensity and shorter duration, anywhere from about a minute to 3 to 4 minutes, taps into your anaerobic system, producing a lot of lactic acid. But here's the thing, there are a number of studies that actually have shown that shorter duration, higher intensity produces greater improvements in aerobic capacity, or VO2 max, than standard long duration aerobic training. So how does this work? Well, there's been a couple studies that have looked at a very short duration. So we're talking about a very high intensity. So we're talking about like 100% of sprinting speed. So full out sprint for 10 seconds. This means that this 10-second bout is actually tapping into that first system we looked at very, very briefly, that phosphagen system or that ATP-PC system. So we're eliciting a very, very high heart rate, but we're not working long enough to produce lactic acid. And this study, what they did was they basically had a protocol of people doing bouts of 10 seconds very, very fast and 30 seconds to recover. They repeated that for about 20 minutes. And in comparison to long duration runs, this group improved their VO2 max dramatically. And one of the reasons that happens is that the researchers believe that because there wasn't enough duration for the work bout to produce lactic acid, and the recovery bouts were significant enough to, again, allow them to recover from those work intervals, there wasn't a lot of lactic acid produced, and therefore they weren't tapping into their anaerobic systems that much. Therefore, they greatly improved their VO2 max. Now, that's not to say that if you tap into your anaerobic systems, you're not going to improve your VO2 max. Yes, you will. But again, you don't have to work light and long to improve your aerobic capacity. Again, intensity is the most important thing. Okay, this is probably the biggest, I think with intervals, the biggest factor in terms of how you feel and the difficulty of any given workouts. The recovery intervals. There's two components. There's the intensity, and this is usually an easy pace. This, if you're running fast, the recovery will just be a very light jog. It's pretty much as simple as that. But it can vary. And then there's the duration, and I believe that the duration is really the key to making your workouts more difficult or more easy. The longer the duration of your recovery bouts, the more time your body has to flush out some of the lactic acid that's produced during a work bout, and as a result, it'll enable itself to recover a lot better for the next work bout. However, if you limit that duration, if you limit that interval, for instance, if you're running 100% or close to 90-95% for a minute, and then you allow yourself 3 minutes to recover, that's a lot of time to recover versus doing 1 minute hard, 1 minute to recover. So the more you start to reduce the length of the duration of your recovery intervals, the more challenging the workout becomes and the more anaerobic it becomes as well. So as this little guy is saying, are these really recovery intervals? And that's a good question, because as you decrease the duration of the intervals, of the recovery intervals, what also happens, as shown as on this graph on the bottom, is that your heart rate naturally increases during the workout. So because you're not really fully allowing a full recovery during every single recovery interval, your heart rate naturally increases. This is a phenomenon known as cardiovascular drift. It's also more pronounced, I guess, if we're talking about dehydration, where your heart rate increases as a result of loss of water volume and thus blood volume. But in this case, it's also relevant to this, because your heart rate is drifting upwards, right? It's increasing during the workout because it's never really allowed to fully recover. So these recovery intervals don't really feel like recovery intervals, and that's why duration is such a big factor in how you perceive the intensity of a given workout. So you might be asking, well, how many intervals should you do? How many intervals within a given workout should you be running? Well, it depends. It depends on how much time you have. If you have an hour to train and you have the fitness level to do an hour's worth of intervals, then by all means go for it. But you don't have to, right? You don't have to do an hour worth of interval training. And again, this will depend on what you're training for. If you're training for a marathon and you're running 2 to 3 hours, then if you're using intervals, you want to be in that time zone. However, if you're running 5, 10K distances, and you're looking at 30 to 60 minutes, you can benefit greatly from anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes of interval training. So you don't have to run that many. And again, it depends on the setup of how the intervals are set up to determine if you have longer duration intervals, right? If you have a 6-minute interval, you only have to run maybe 3 or 4 as opposed to 10, right? So how much time do you have? And again, what are you training for? Again, what's your training goal? The duration of the event, as we just talked about. If the duration of the event is 30 minutes, if you're running a fast 5K, let's say under 20 minutes, that's very, very fast. You want your intervals to be high intensity and maybe shorter in duration at the beginning, and then increasing that duration over time. We're going to talk about a more specific example of 5K training in just a few moments. But again, you don't need that many intervals, and it's going to depend on how you set your workout up in the first place. And again, fat loss, if you're training for fat loss, in terms of what your goal is, you also want to consider something known as EPOC, or your excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. What this means is that as the intensity increases during your workout, you burn more calories afterwards. So as this graph depicts, the greater the intensity during the workout, so the greater the intensity of your work intervals, is going to stimulate your metabolism much, much more than if you had a lower intensity workout. And the more of those intervals you do, in a given workout, the higher your metabolism is going to be raised for after the workout. That means your body's going to spend more time burning calories after you're done. And this is huge. Some studies show that up to 36 hours after an interval training session of good intensity, you're still burning calories. That's known as EPOC. That's huge. And so if you're training for fat loss, you may want to be looking at longer duration and higher intensity for your intervals. And we'll talk about that as well in a couple moments.